That's it for Zoom instructions. So Leonard, I'm going to hand it off to you, our amazing MOHAI Executive Director.
Okay, well, thank you, Nicole. And it's great to have everyone here this evening. Thank you for joining us. We have an incredible program tonight, and it's one more in our series of democracy dialogues. I hope you've had a chance to join us. This is the fourth one. And today we're going to be talking about education, schooling the public, and a look at some of the issues of how education is really such a fundamental building block of our democracy. And if education isn't strong and a strong foundation, then our democracy will show cracks and weaknesses going forward. Our democracy dialogues are part of a larger initiative that many of you have been a part of. We call it Stand Up Seattle, the Democracy Project. And it's all about civic literacy and bringing a variety of perspectives to these forums. And we hope you'll continue to join us for these all the way through March of next year. So something to look forward to. Well, before we begin tonight, and as we always do when we start a program at MOHAI, whether we meet virtually or whether we meet in person, we take a moment to acknowledge that we gather on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, and all Coast Salish people. We acknowledge their forced displacement of Native communities and their endurance. And I particularly call attention to the fact that the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle, have never been federally recognized. To understand more about that history, that experience, and the Duwamish community today, I really encourage you to visit the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center. It's not open right now. It's closed until things are safe again. But you can also look for the Duwamish Longhouse online as well. Their physical location is in West Seattle. And I also want to make a note that this program, and really all of our democracy dialogues, have taken place during this period of unprecedented protest against police violence towards Black people. Protests here in Seattle and across the nation are a call for each of us to act and state unequivocally that Black lives matter. MOHAI states that and stands firmly on the side of inclusion, equity, and cultural empathy. Well, tonight we have two amazing speakers to bring to you that will talk about education and its role in a vibrant democracy. Brandon Hershey is the school board director for the Seattle School District. Brandon represents District 7, which includes Southeast Seattle for the Seattle Public Schools. He also teaches at Rainier View Elementary School in the Federal Way Public School District. He's an active teachers union member, and he's a former federal government policy analyst. Brandon, we're looking forward to talking to you in a second. And we're also joined by Dr. Ed Taylor. Ed is Vice Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Academic Affairs at the University of Washington, where he oversees educational opportunities that advance and deepen the undergraduate academic experience. A professor also in the College of Education, Dr. Taylor's research interests include the moral dimensions of education, leadership in education, and social justice. And Dr. Taylor has his PhD from the University of Washington. Well, I'm just delighted to welcome both Ed and Brandon to the conversation. And gentlemen, at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Brandon, I'm going to say what an honor it is to spend time with you on this Saturday evening.
Oh man, I feel similarly, man. This is a great way to spend a Saturday night.
Yeah. And I'm listening to the introduction. I just want to be clear about something, because it's powerful to hear the work that you're doing, both in your elected role and as a teacher also. When I think about my work at the university, it is tied to and interdependent to the work that you do. So our success at the university is very much tied to your work as a teacher and as an educator. So I'm just grateful for what you do.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can't say anything but, high praises to the secondary education system. I mean, for us, I think that we have conversations with our second graders even about how important it is to not only, graduate high school, but whatever their post-secondary track might be, to make sure that college is an option. And having people like you who look like our students at the upper echelons of that system really makes our job easy, because they have some really great mirrors at the top.
So I got a question for you, and I know this isn't an interview, me interviewing you, but something about the statement that you made before you joined the school board, and even talking about educating second graders. There was something that stood out to me that I just have to ask you about, because one, you say, and this is a quote from you, "I was raised in a family of proud Black educators. And before she passed away, you said, my mother taught history at my hometown high school, where my sister currently serves as an assistant principal." And you say, throughout my childhood, I saw a lifelong impact that a teacher of color can have on students from marginalized communities. What does that mean to you to have a family of educators like that, Black educators, and how does that inform who you are now? Because I want to share that story with you.
For sure, for sure. I mean, it meant everything to me. You know, I grew up in a school, and more so than I think a lot of us could even really appreciate, right? So my mother would spend the vast majority of her summers not only going to workshops, but also helping other teachers prepare their classrooms, lesson planning. I remember even during the summer and over winter break and all the other breaks, you know, when I could see my friends, you know, having a good trip or vacation with their parents, I was oftentimes with my mom in her classroom preparing for the next semester. And so for me, it was that constant exposure to learning and constant exposure to the amount of grit that it takes, not to just be a teacher, but to be a really phenomenal teacher, that really instilled in me the values and how I show up in my classroom today. You know, and I say this often, I get phone calls to this day about the impact that my mother, who's passed away for almost 15 years at this point, I still get phone calls to this day from former students of hers who are in their 40s who are calling and saying what an amazing inspiration she was on their life. And so for me, that type of stock has always been in my blood, and it's a goal that I'm consistently trying to live up to. But for me, it's one that's also unachievable, right? Because for educators, and you know this firsthand, Ed, there's no good enough. There's no standard. You just got to wake up every single day and ask yourself, how can I be better than the day before? What can I give to my students and my community more so than I did the day before? And really just having that moral compass in my own professional life has been critical in not only the way that I show up with my students in my classroom, but also the way that I show up on the school board advocating for the 53,000 students in the Seattle Public School District.
That matters so much, you know, because you had me thinking about, my mother wasn't a teacher. She was a woman. I grew up in a small community, and she wasn't a public educator, but she was a pianist. She played the piano. We had a little piano in our house. We lived very modestly, but she taught piano out of the house. So every day I would come and go as a kid. I would walk by, and she was always teaching someone. And here was this proud Black woman who was teaching kids how to play the piano and teaching them at a level of excellence. I had such pride in her and such a sort of that cultural expectation. Her very best friend, Miss Dorothy Jackson, who was an educator, a teacher, and ultimately became a principal of the school that I went to, and they were best friends. So the problem I always had, I'd come home and my mother would be sitting there near the piano. Miss Jackson, who was a principal and or teacher, was sitting in the house, and they were always there together. So you had these two Black women who would always be sort of looking at me going, "Oh, Eddie, did you do your homework? How you doing, Eddie?" And this level of expectation was just so powerful. So not only were they educators in their own respect, they were educators in the context of our lives. So they just had this level of expectation, didn't make it easy, set high standards. They knew the context of your life. And it was this relational kind of thing where you knew that they were going to be with you the rest of your life. I would go back until she passed away about 10 years ago. I'd go back and visit Miss Jackson and tell her how much she meant, and tell her she was a student at Bethune-Cookman. So she was Mary McLeod Bethune's student. So you had this proud legacy of what it meant, not just to do well in school, but what it meant to live a good life and to show up every day and be responsible and be a good citizen and live a good life. And that was such a powerful thing to be educated in that context, because learn how to live and love and challenge and move through school. But there's another thing that was in your bio that I found so powerful. You're a scout leader in the South End of Seattle. So how do scouts inform your work, and why a scout leader?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and down south, scouts is a big part of a lot of the early experiences for a lot of boys. It's something that's really big in that part of the country. And for me, I actually stumbled upon scouting. I was actually playing with a friend of mine. And one day his mother just said, "Okay, we're going to go sign up for scouts." And I was like, "Oh, I want to go do that too." And then one thing leads to another. And it's been probably one of the most impactful organizations I've ever been a part of. I went all the way through, became an Eagle Scout. And for me, though, what I really love about my experience here in Seattle in scouting versus my experience in Mississippi is that in Mississippi, scouting is an incredibly white activity. There are only a couple of Black kids in my troop, and out of all of the other troops that I witnessed, there were maybe maybe either like 4 or 5 kids that looked like me throughout my entire experience. And with that, scouting, while it is very near and dear to my heart, and really has given me a sense of added to that moral compass that I was talking about earlier, it's also where I experienced my first instances of racism as well. And so being able to hold both of those things, finding value in the organization and the tenets and all of the benefits that it provides down the line, while also being able to be critical of the organization that's got a really steep history in racism and child abuse, bringing that experience to Seattle, I knew that I wanted to do something different. And this troop that I now serve as the Scoutmaster for, Troop 008, was actually started by a good friend of mine and, his brother and another Scoutmaster, Michael Charles and Adrian Cowens, started an exclusively African-American troop, Washington State's only African-American scout troop. And what's really beautiful about this is that we're not, and it started by 4 Black Eagle Scouts, right? So as you can imagine, we're not exactly a dime a dozen, we're a rare breed. And so having all of those, really what I would consider brothers to me at this point, just leading by example, I think that we flip the narrative of what Scouts is and what it can be on its head, right? So for us, it's less about, the traditions of going out and like camping. While all those things are important and we do that, we're also very unapologetic about the way that we can utilize these very historic and prestigious systems to not only provide access to our Scouts, but also to give them a language and to make them literate in the tenets of leadership, community involvement, stewardship of the great outdoors, and those types of experiences are invaluable in social capital in terms of being successful here in a place like Seattle, where we're really blessed to have a lot of natural beauty, so much so that being able to articulate your appreciation for that while also being unapologetic about the way that we as Black men show up in our community provides a really unique experience for our boys. One thing that I wanted to double back to, though, before we move on to the next piece, is that you said something really poignantly that stood out for me when you were, recalling your mother's experience in terms of, teaching piano. And one thing that I would love for you to highlight, if you could, was for me, similarly, especially after my mother passed away, being a Black teacher in our home school district, I had a dozen mothers after that fact that were always consistently looking out for me. And I think that it's really special about our community is that even if a person isn't a teacher, almost every person in the Black community, especially if you're growing up in a place like Mississippi or especially here in Seattle, is an educator in some right. And I would really like to hear a little bit more about what was your experience growing up in a community like that? What were some of the values that you took away from having so much history in all of the people that surrounded you, and how did they participate in your education, even if it wasn't in a formal schooling environment?
That's such a beautiful question. This was a small enough town that that kids that were walking through the community were in some ways everybody's kids. So everybody knew that I was Miss Taylor's kids, no matter where I went, no matter what park I was in, no matter what store I was in, everybody kind of knew and took some responsibility. So there was this almost this coalition that surrounded me. So I felt safe first and foremost, and I felt inspired. There were also, I'll be honest, Brandon, there were some times when my family just struggled. I mean, there would be times when the lights would be out and it would just be dark in our house. And there'd be times when we just struggled with sort of basic needs. And, it was interesting because people would sometimes just drop by the house and maybe bring a little food or something. Or Miss Jackson, this educator, would just drop by. And there were times when, I'll tell you, Brandon, it would be dark in the house. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't have any lights and there'd be candles in the house. And she would look over at me through the candlelight and say, "So Ed, have you done your homework?" And I look at her like, "Man, you know that the lights are out. Like, why would you be talking to me about homework right now?" And I realized afterwards that she was like, "You're going to school in the morning and you still need to do your work. And I know this is going on for you. I've got the context for you. I understand this. And I'm going to ask you to show up tomorrow. I'm going to walk right with you." And in some ways, it felt like there were people that were walking along with lights that were saying, "I'm not going to do this for you, but I'm going to show you the way. So just follow this light and keep following the light." And to have a community of people that pushed you and challenged you, even made mistakes along the way, because I don't want to make this sound like it was nirvana. But
Right.
people would say, you know, keep taking a step, keep taking a step. We're right there with you. And if we failed, it's not like we disappeared. There was a sense that if kids didn't succeed,
Mm-hmm.
there were still kids in the community. So you'd see him on the corner and you'd say, that's old Pookie right there. And he's still
Right.
are. So you never gave up on kids, because there wasn't a sense of invisibility. They were always kids. They were always people in the community that belonged. And there was a sense of, we are all a part of this. So it wasn't about individual success. It was about communitarian success. I do want to share something with you, because I asked you about the Scouts, because when I came to Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
and this was in the 90s. I'd been here for a little bit, but I started to go to the Meredith Matthews YMCA, and I went into what used to be the Central District, and I walked into the YMCA, and I was going to go up to the gym and just shoot some baskets, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and the gym was empty. So I went to the program director, and I said, I've come to this gym a couple of Saturdays and there's no kids in this gym. Like, how can there be an empty gym in the center of Seattle? And he said, well, I can't get kids to come. And so I said, well, look, his name was Kyle. I said, look, why don't we do this? Give me a couple of basketballs and give me a couple of weekends. And let me see if I can get some kids to come in. Just let me see if I can do this word of mouth. So the first weekend, there were 10 kids. Second weekend, there were 25 kids. The third weekend, there were 40 kids. And I said, okay, so Kyle, now what I need you to do is I need you to get some jerseys, some red ones, some blue ones, some green ones. I need you to get some referees. They don't even have to know how to do basketball, but just some whistles and a bat, because now you got a league. Right? And so we started this, and kids were showing up on the weekend, all kids, and we started this league basically. And whoever wanted to come, whatever, and these were like 5 and 6 and 7 year olds. They were young kids. Girls and boys played on the same team. And we created this league, and parents would come in with their kids and they'd say, well, you know, my son Spencer has never played basketball before. And I'd stop parents and I'd say, I don't care, you know, they're 5 years old. None of them are good at this age. Just bring them in. And I can assure you that in a couple of weeks, here's some things that they're going to learn. And the focus was on learning. I can assure you that I can teach your son to go from this to, or your daughter to go from this to this. So what you need to do is trust this and let us do this together. And then as kids started to develop skill, I'd say, okay, so now that you've learned how to dribble with your left hand, your job is to make sure that other kids can dribble with their left hand. And we started to create this kind of team culture. And then we started to say, okay, your success is tied to the success of the kids on your team. And we didn't keep score. We didn't have wins and losses at that time, but we just created this space where kids can come in, whoever they were could actually participate and play at that age. Everybody was getting better at the same time. We were focused on learning. So if you thought you were good at something, I'm going to give you something else to challenge you. Everyone was accessible. And the concept was to have it last and endure and actually create kind of a community. In some ways, I was thinking about my own growing up, my own sense of community. I wanted to sort of talk about youth agency things and the work that you're doing in part, because when we talk about schools, we get to contentious stuff and debating right away, but we don't yet have a vision for what collaborative, cooperative, coalition building looks like in and around schools. And in your work as a serving on the school board, I wanted at least for us to have a vision of, if we were to start with a blank slate, because it was important for me to walk into an empty gym and start new, rather than have leagues and skill sets and boys and girls, but it allowed me to say, we've got an empty gym and we can actually create this anew. Do you ever have a sense, Brandon, when you wake up each day and think about education policy and education reform, do you ever have the sense of what it can look like if we were to start again and start anew, and what the vision is for that, based on how you were raised, based on the kind of educator you are now? Because even as you describe what you're doing, you're the kind of teacher I think we should have in every classroom. And no, we can't expect all teachers to do the kinds of things that you're doing, but here you are teaching, you're serving in a community as a scout leader and developing leaders, and you're serving in a policy role. And that's a lot of stuff to go on for an educator. What a powerful vision that is.
Oh man, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I think that it all boils back, and really you so eloquently put in this idea of community education, right? And so for me, I had a very similar experience growing up in Hattiesburg. It was a very hands-on, from every stretch of the imagination type of experience. And that's the type of leadership that I want to bring to wherever my community might be. I'm very fortunate to my fiance for bringing me here to South Seattle, and we're laying down deep roots here. But that's just it, right? I cannot sit still, because of how important community has been, not only in my experience, because if it wasn't for my community growing up, especially coming from a single parent household, experiencing the trauma that I did as a young person, I I am not supposed to be sitting in this seat based on everything that our society wants us to believe about Black boys in our country. And it is because I have been afforded all of these amazing life chances, largely because I stand on the shoulders of giants for my community, that I am striving to be that for some other child. And the more that I do, the more roles that I serve in, the more I just continue to show up, that is going to provide that opportunity to intersect with a kid who needs to see what that looks like in a community. So for me, that's just why I get up every morning. It's why I can't find myself sitting still. It's why I don't do a good job of taking vacations. And I know that you know this firsthand as well. It's because we have a responsibility. Each and every one of us do. And your contribution could look different. More than likely it does, right? But for me and how I see my position in this world, showing up continually and being that mirror and that shoulder and that support system for whoever might need it at that moment is the only way that I know how to operate. And I think that it's really interesting that you brought up this idea of starting from that blank gym, right? And for school policy, it's almost even having the courage to see the gym as blank, because there are so many competing interests. For the school board, more so than I think even some of our national forms of government, there are so many special interest groups, right? And folks are always advocating for their kid and their experience. And with a district as large as ours, with 53,000 students, as you can imagine, there are so many competing interests. But what we have to be able to do in order to, to your point, really reimagine education, is we have to have the courage to look past all of that, to think on balance, right? And so these are two things that I found that have been really helpful in decision making and policy creation from my end, because coming from a background in policy, especially at the federal level, you're trained to think through all of the potential unintended consequences and how to mitigate as much risk as possible. But really, when you're trying to rebuild a system like we desperately need to do in Seattle Public Schools, you have to simplify it down to really a very simple question. And I ask myself two. The first one deals with 7 generations principle. Before I make any decision, before I take any vote, I sit down and I ask myself, how is this going to impact a child 7 generations from now, right? And then the second question I ask myself is also very simple. Is the decision that I'm about to make going to eliminate or perpetuate racial inequity in our system? And I believe strongly that if all of our elected officials operated with that mindset, we would be headed in a very different direction than we have been, especially nationally for the past 4 years, but even locally, as we have conversations about what does educational equity actually look like beyond the buzzword that is equity, right? And so that is really how I approach, building community, is by first establishing what are our common values, right? Because we all have different ideas about how we can get certain policy outcomes, how we can create better educational environments for all of our students, how can we, mitigate some of the wrong that has been done and some of the systemic racism that is very present in our district. But until we can establish our common values and then also accept our varying beliefs about how do we achieve those values, then we can start having a conversation about what needs to happen to advance us toward those aims, right? So that's really how I try to approach as much of my role in the school board as possible.
Brandon, I so appreciate it. And something, as I'm listening to you, I'm seeing the importance of a conversation that moves to the continuum of education. Because one of the things that I think that I want to make sure that universities aren't creating an unintended consequence. And that is, you and I started out talking about community good. You and I started talking about not individual Black boys, but Black boys being successful writ large. We talked about communities that are engaged and committed. We talked about coalition building and the ways in which schools can be in partnership with other organizations, nonprofit organizations. And I worry that now that when I talk to young kids in high school, The things that they're worried about is, will I be able to get into the University of Washington? Are my test scores good enough? Are my grades good enough? I hear kids say to me, I don't have a 3.9 grade point average, so I'm not even going to apply to the university. And I'm hearing a level of stress that I have to be perfect to be able to get into. Now you see how the narrative shifted from a collective good to a community good to what I have to do to be able to get into this school so that I can go on. And it went from a collective we to an I. And I know at the end of the day, somebody's going to get an admissions letter that says you either did or did not get in. But I'm at a public university, which is meant to serve the state of Washington. And there are about 130 or 140 different post-secondary institutions in the state of Washington. All of those institutions are meant to do something, which is to create access for young people to be able to get to college. And so I want to be careful on my end, on the university end, that we don't create this very narrow elite vision of, if you aren't this, then you can't make it here, or you don't belong here. Here you are, a story also of, because you mentioned earlier that you were a Truman Scholar, which is a powerful thing. And I think you have to mention what that means, and what then you think is your responsibility to the collective good, given that, because that's an individual accolade, but it means something. So what does it mean to be a Truman Scholar for you?
Yeah, for me, it means that, I have to worry a little bit less about paying for graduate school. So for those of you who don't know, a Truman Scholar is it's a prestigious award that is awarded to usually one, sometimes two college juniors per state who are interested in serving in public service in some way. And it's named in honor of our 33rd president, Harry S. Truman. And what the real opportunity there is the network of being connected with other like-minded change makers in their communities who are interested in some form of government, public service, something like that. So in the realms of education, nonprofit work, elected office potentially. And that's really kind of the scholarship in itself. For me, what that meant, being selected as, the first African-American Truman Scholar for my university, was just carrying forward in confirmation, quite frankly, of all of the values that my parents and my community had instilled in me, and really bringing those stories to a national stage to show that you don't necessarily have to be the most capable student, because I certainly was not. And you surely don't have to have, a long list of accolades to be recognized in a way to where you are making a difference in your community. And one of the things that you hit on really poignantly, and I want to double back with a little bit of a story, is that this idea of what makes, a perfect college applicant, or the access that we provide to individuals based on resume line items and their access to spaces of privilege during their high school and pre-high school careers, right? And so for me, I remember during my selection process, there's this ceremony that happens after where you bring all of the scholars together. And there were folks that were basically saying like, oh, I had studied abroad in India, and my dad ran for governor, and I spoke at the Democratic National Convention. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh, my dad repairs copiers, you know what I'm saying? So there's a very huge disconnect, especially for individuals of color, as we break through some of these more protected spaces, to where we are bringing forth a level of resilience that comes from those types of experiences like you mentioned, Ed, where you were sitting in your home and the lights might not have been on, but you were still expected to go to school the next day. When my mother passed away, I was out for 3 days, and then I was right back in my chair in 6th grade in Miss Davis's classroom. And it's not just that resilience, but also that resilience as well as the expectation that you will not use your experiences and your circumstances as a crutch or an excuse not to perform at the highest level of excellence and give back to your community in a significant way, because your community is the only reason that you're here to begin with. So when we back that up and really think about how we as educators are on the opposite side of what you talked about, right? We, in so many ways, perpetuate the problem by saying, you have to be this good at this skill in order to get into college. You need to be working at this place, at this pace, serving in this leadership role, and you've got to fill your resume with all of these experiences in order to be competitive. And that is really where I think the rub is, because for many of us, moving from a space where we are deep in community to a space to now we are expected to be competitive is an uncomfortable and unrealistic transition, especially for communities of color, right? So as we think about that, and as we think about what is the intersection between democracy and education, we as educators throughout the entire spectrum of the system need to be thinking very, very hard about what are we preparing our children for, and how are we preparing them for it? Are we preparing them to be competitive to get into a college that might just run up their debt and they might not even end up using the degree that they're earning? Or are we preparing them to be productive contributors to their community, wherever that might be and whatever that pathway might look for them post-secondary education?
But I'm going to challenge something you said, because you said a word in there, because in that you said that you became a true, and you weren't one of the most capable. You weren't even that capable. You used the word capable, but yet everything you said up to that point suggested that you were capable. And there's a quick story that I have about a student of mine who dropped out of our teacher ed program.
Yeah.
And I really don't, I try the best I can to make sure that students don't drop out of any level of any of their education. That's my goal, to make sure that students stick with it and they feel good. So this gentleman, and he was in his 40s, and he lived some life. He'd worked at Boeing, and he wanted to be a teacher. And he was a math guy. He was just a really, really good math guy. And he came in and he turned in a paper for me, and he said goodbye. And I said, well, why are you saying goodbye? You've got the next quarter, and you got the next quarter. And he said, I'm done. He said, I'm quitting. And I said, well, let's sit down. I got to have that talk with you about sticking with it and about resilience, all that kind of stuff. And he says, look, you're going to tell me to stick with this. You're going to tell me what kind of teacher I'd be. He looked at me and he said, Ed, I got to tell you this. I love math. I'm good at math. I love math. I'm a secondary teacher. I don't like kids. I really don't like, I do not like high school kids. And I said, case made, your case is made. And so his capability was mathematics. He said, I want to go back to Boeing. I want to be an engineer. I do not, and any part of me, I do not like high school kids. I don't want to be around them. They drive me crazy. I just want to cane them. I don't. And I said, cool. And so he weeded himself out in that respect. So that question of what makes for capability, he had high math capacity, but the other stuff, he knew himself that the other things that make for good educators and good teachers, he was clear. I don't have that. I don't even have the desire to have it. I just want to do what I do well. And it was a powerful thing. So there's that notion of what constitutes capable, because I think we've narrowed what constitutes accessibility to college, what makes even for a good college student, what makes even for a good college graduate. And the things that you were just describing are the kinds of things that I think are the kinds of things that make for a democracy to work. That kind of engagement, that kind of caring, that kind of commitment to learning. And that kind of commitment to growth, and that commitment beyond self to community. And I think in some ways we are, I'm going to say public education, Seattle public education, this is some of the work that, as critical as we are, in some ways, we are dealing with the product of our own success, in the sense that I see a lot of young people in our community that have their fist in the air, that are walking with bullhorns saying we've had enough of certain things, and they're calling for change. They're calling for change around public safety. They're calling for change around environmental justice. Oftentimes at the university on campus, when we aren't struck by COVID, there are high school students that are showing up regularly saying things need to change in our community. And as hard as that is, to deal with that kind of conflict, there's a part of me that says that kind of coalition building and young people who are finding their voice and who are saying we need to renew a commitment to change around racial justice, around environmental justice. In some ways, I see these young people and I'm going, okay, so something's working, and democracy's loud right now, and this is really hard. I don't want it to go to anger and destruction. And I don't think that's our young people. I think that's something else. But part of me sees that this is a hard conversation to have right now, but that kind of truth-telling and engagement and commitment to a common good is the kind of stuff that we've been educating for in the first place, as hard as it is. So in some ways, I see it as an indication of not perfection on behalf of public schools, but I see some good things that are happening. And I see that kind of coalition building as part of the good, because I see a lot of young people who are active, a lot of young people who are running for public office like yourself, a lot of young people that are actually aiming toward public service. And I think that's a really, really good thing.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I actually have one story that highlights that perfectly, right? So during this summer, when we had the senseless murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and quite frankly, countless other at the hands of police violence, Seattle Public Schools was considering terminating our relationship with the Seattle Police Department. Initially, we had decided that we wanted to take a 1-year moratorium on the relationship and really take a moment to reevaluate what is the purpose of policing in our schools. And I have to give a shout out to the youth organizers at WABLOC, Be Seattle, and Black and Brown Lives Matter, who pushed us to say, no, we don't need a 1-year ban. We need that ban to be permanent and indefinite, because we know firsthand what the experiences are in our schools, and you are accountable to us. And it is that type of partnership when the youth meet the board in conjunction together, when we can work together, we avoid what we call equity detours and process that we as adults see firsthand is like, oh, well, we've got to take time to be able to, ask this group and get this opinion and figure out this policy in this intersection, right? It goes back to how we're trained as we matriculate through these systems when we have the youth who are actually living this experience day to day, and they see firsthand the impacts of policing on their system. When we can bring those two interests together and really put community, and specifically young people, in the driver's seat as it pertains to education policy that ultimately, impacts them more so than anyone in our system, then we get to progressive change and outcomes that actually make a difference in the experience of those young people. One thing that I really would love to talk to you about before we move on to the next piece is this idea of, and we talked a little bit about this before we got on the call, but it was this idea that once you get to some of these places, once you've arrived at a place like college, and I know this is true for me on the board, I think that we, especially as young people of color, I see folks like you, Ed, sitting in the seat that you're in. And for me, you are the mirror that so many of our young people need to see, that like at the top of higher education in this state. But when you arrive there, you start to realize that there are the people that are surrounding you who are your colleagues, who you once looked at as these, these folks who are at the higher echelon of service to their community, are actually quite normal in comparison to the rest of us, right? So could you talk a little bit about what your experience in coming to that realization has been?
I just love the way you asked that question. I'm going to give you an honest answer, because in some ways it's a humbling response to what you just said, because I'm at a university, and I'm at a university that is by all measures considered an elite university. I'm surrounded by really, really talented, devoted people that I come and I get to be in their company every day. And our mission is a public mission. And I'm just around people that are just very much committed to the common good. And but something is not lost on me, and it's this, that because when you're first generation, everything just always feels new. You always, and some of it is a struggle of, I'm here, it feels new every day. I come to a university. It's not a question of belonging anymore, because I know I belong here. But I will say, when I was in middle school, I was a really good student. And I got awards for being a good student. And I grew, I'm not standing up right now, but I grew to be like 6'4" by the time I was in 8th grade, 6'5". And then I started getting awards for playing sports, for playing basketball. Right. And I really, by chance, I was an okay high school basketball player, but it was really by serendipity that I happened to have a really good game when a college coach was sitting in the gym on a Friday night at my little public high school. And that coach was at Gonzaga University and offered me a scholarship based on that moment. So I got to go to college when a lot of my classmates didn't. My brother didn't go to college. My sister didn't go to college. But I went really in large measure because of serendipity. If he had come the next Friday when I had a bad game, I may not have gotten that offer. So I went to Gonzaga University, and I got there, and there's a book that I have on my shelf. It's a book called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, by the author Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers from Prison. I got this book, and I realized in this semester school, in this small theology class, that I went through high school and was never asked to read a book in its entirety. Right. And I had to sit there and figure out how to read this theology text, surrounded by kids from prep schools and I had to figure out how to learn with them. And you and I shared the story a little bit that it took me a while. It took me a lot of hours, far more, twice, if not 3 times the amount of time to actually get this sense of not only feeling like I belong, but actually earning the right to be there and convincing myself that and once I figured out how to learn, and once I figured out that it's not that kids around me are smarter, they had been schooled differently,
Right.
but there are ways that we can engage with each other and ways in which we can make each other better. And there are ways in which I realized that I have something that they may not, and they complement me in other ways. And then I had the sense that, okay, so I belong here now, and I'm going to do this work. Yes, I'm at a university, and I do think about the fact that getting access to college should not be serendipitous. It should not be by chance. That sense of belonging, that sense of a vision from the second grade kids that you work with to post-secondary education should be based on learning, the beauty of learning, the breadth of learning, this having a vision of what one wants to be in the world, that sense of imagination. And so I look back now, I work around people that, because the world is open to them, when they walk across the bridge, they start to think, well, how was that bridge built? And what does it mean to be an engineer? And people who look at water and just think, God, I want to study the ocean. I want to study the seas. So they can look in the air and think, I want to study clouds and space. And that kind of learning and walking in the world, really being a passionate learner and just seeing learning in everything that we do, and seeing curiosity in everything that we do, seeing even conflict in our communities. George Floyd was a tragic, tragic moment, but it wasn't a moment in time. And we know that when we think about things three-dimensionally, because for me, George Floyd is connected to Emmett Till, is connected to a history and legacy. And so we understand that when we understand the history from which we come, and we understand contemporarily, like, what does that mean for public safety? And what does that mean for the future now? What we want far beyond how do we think about this related to undoing the prison industrial system? These are complex problems, complex issues that we call young people and all of our people to actually be a part of. And that's a very different kind of conversation than, no, there's an elite college, and if you get in, then your life's going to be better. I think what you and I are both talking about is when you get access to this process of education, this process of lifelong learning, and we engage in our communities in such a way that we just want to make this idea, this concept of a democracy better, which requires us, which demands us to engage, to be educators, to mentor young people, to be scout leaders, to open up gym doors at YMCAs, and to go back and run for public office and do public policy. The dimensions in which you're doing all of this are just so powerful. So I come at it with a degree of humility and a degree of connectedness to the work that you're doing, again, because I do think that in our community, we have a right, and I think our public should critique schools. I do worry that we get stuck in the critique, and we don't have a sense of what we want the vision to be. So when we think about Seattle School Board, we go right to critique. When we think about the superintendent, we go right to critique. There's a place for that. When we go to schools, we go right to critique. But that next level of what's our vision for schooling that cuts across schools? What's our vision for leadership that cuts across the state and across the district? What does that mean to care about my kid in my school in Aki Karosi, but also care about the common good and make the system better? And I don't know how to reconvene that kind of conversation. When I say reconvene, I remember people do have a memory of John Stanford when he was superintendent. This might have been before your time. And I didn't get to work with Superintendent Stanford, but what I saw him do once, he gave a talk, and he was wearing a cavalry hat at this talk, and he was standing in the community. It was an all-white community. And I remember I was sitting in the audience watching him thinking, how's he going to talk to these folks? Because it's a really wealthy community. And he took off his hat and he talked about leading troops in the military, in his time there in his service, and the kind of trust that it took and the kind of values that it took to actually to fight for your country, to lead and put people's lives at risk and have people's lives at stake.
Yeah.
And then he made the transition, and he took his hat off and he held his hat up and he said, I want you to trust Seattle Public Schools again. And he said, part of my job is to end some of the divisiveness and have you believe that you can trust to send your kids, and not only your kids, but that you can trust our district to support all kids again and to come back. And he was basically calling people back and calling the community in. And I thought that was kind of interesting. because he knew that there was plenty of conflict, but he was also trying to get to a place where he was calling people in. And he seemed to inspire people by using rhetoric that wasn't divisive, but using rhetoric that was challenging, but inclusive. And not in a soft kind of way, but in a really challenging and deep kind of way. In your leadership role, what kind of responsibility do you feel like you have to both embrace the divisiveness and embrace the critique, but also call people into the work in our city and in our district?
Absolutely. And I think that wow, the way that you arrived at that question just in itself and giving a history lesson at the same time just shows your impact as an educator.
Been around here longer than you have.
Appreciate it. So yeah, so for me, I think that the number one aim that we as especially school board directors, and I think that this can be cross-applied to districts all across the country, is figuring out how do we sit in community, take the critique, but at the same time with that critique, we're looking past the immediate problem that's being presented, and we're able to identify the trauma that is bringing that person out of their home, out of their routine to come tell us about it, right? And that's where I think we as elected officials, regardless of your commitment, need to really be sitting. Because one of the problems that I think boards run into, and the Seattle School Board is no different, is that we find Band-Aid solutions to longevical problems that have superseded so many of us in this system, to where we don't actually know what was the initial point of trauma that started this conversation decades ago. And really where we have to be able to sit is to uncover that so that we can fully understand it and do our part in what we can to heal it. Because when we only make policy in the interest of the right now, without taking into account all of the history that led to this moment and all of the trauma or all of the success that could come after it, then we're missing our opportunity and our responsibility as board directors. I think even more so, one of the things that you said was around how do we return this conversation and how do we return our community, quite frankly, to a position of trust. And that is really holding our leadership accountable in a way that you mentioned, not only through critique, but also finding a way to bridge and span boundaries. You know, in the school district, you see we have very, very different actors that hold a lot of power. We have our school board, we have senior staff, we have our education association, we have our parent groups. And when something goes wrong, especially because this is dealing directly with our children, we are immediately looking for who do we go to fix it? How do we hold that person or that system accountable? And what does it look like to get rectified in some way? And where we really need to arrive is, how do we do the visioning you're talking about with everyone at the table at the onset, with putting the voices who have traditionally been marginalized and provided less access at the forefront of those conversations? Because when you think about it, our system isn't designed in the interest of kids, right? Our system is designed, because you have to think about what was public education even designed to do at its onset. You know, 100 years ago, it was designed to make really good factory workers, right? Sit down, walk in a straight line, raise your hand, don't speak unless you're spoken to. That skill set does not yield for a productive life in our current society. And public education, quite frankly, has not caught up. So when we're thinking about the problems that we're trying to solve in the environment that's archaic in its nature to begin with, we're really fighting two really significant forces that are causing an immense amount of tension. And the only way that we are going to progress in any significant manner is that if we, as the leaders of this system, come together in a way that we are moving forward as a unified voice, right? Because even though we all profess to be advocating for children, the way the district advocates for children is very different than the way the Education Association advocates for children, which is very different than the way the board advocates for children. I'm really blessed to where I get to see it from two of those vantage points, but really my biggest takeaway from my first year in this position has been for us to move forward in any significant way. we have to be willing to see each other and accept each other where we are at in that moment. Because if the moment that we start rejecting people's lived experiences and truth, and we start canceling them before they are given the opportunity to not only develop their position, but also build a clear understanding of, maybe an opposing point, we are losing out on an opportunity to see one another. And the only people who lose out when we as adults don't see each other and work together are our students. So if we're really going to be serious about moving forward, reimagining education, putting our district on track to where we need to be, we as leaders, quite frankly, need to get ourselves together and start communicating in a way that is productive and healthy and gives validation to the folks who are coming to the table, but at the same time, making sure that we're prioritizing the voices of our most marginalized citizens.
Precisely. Well said, Brandon.
Yeah, Brandon, that really was well said. Gentlemen, I'm going to interrupt at this part. I hate to, this is the worst part of our democracy dialogues, is I have two brilliant people like you deeply in conversation, and they make me jump in and interrupt it. But I want to do that mainly to say that, I wish a conversation like this could be broadcast to every citizen in our community, because both of you give us such hope that we can think our way smartly and act our way through some of the challenges we face. But we do have some questions, and they're fairly tactical. So maybe this will exercise, another side of our brains. And let me just start with one of them, which is what is not being taught in the Seattle public schools, or generally in our public school systems in this region? One of our listeners asked, is science being taught? Is fact-based inquiry or critical thinking or civics, or all the kinds of things that we know we need to have in every single young person? So Brandon's rubbing his hands together. So what's the score on that?
Let me tell you. Okay, so I want to paint a little picture for you, right? So in my opinion, what's not being taught are civics, history, and science. And then if you think about the moment, the really horrible moment we're in our country and in our world, where we have an electorate that refuses to believe the science of a pandemic, where we have folks who are actively making the choice to refuse the teachings of the scientists who create vaccines and understand how viruses operate, against the backdrop that has been swelling for decades of racial unrest for the senseless murders of Black people, men and women, at the hands of police. Yet we as educators are only allotted 45 minutes 3 times a week for science and history. And that is not a problem that's unique to Seattle. That is a problem that we have nationally. The fact that we have doubled down primarily on reading and math in this country as our means of education has literally put us in the place that we are now. So moving forward, the conversation needs to be, what are we prepared to do to change not only what we teach to our students, but how we teach it is going to determine what the future of this country looks like, because we are educating the electorate. And if we are not spending time teaching history, then the old saying reigns true that we are going to be doomed to repeat it. And we are seeing that over and over again, day after day, for the past 4 years, as our democracy seems to be eroding at a really astonishing clip. I fear very greatly that we might be a tad too far into this era of disinformation and alternative facts, to the point to where the way that we teach history in Washington is going to look real different than the way that folks teach history in my home state of Mississippi. And when we have competing understandings of events, that does not yield for a very successful democracy long term. So if we are actually going to be serious about getting our country back on track It starts in the classroom and it starts in kindergarten. It's not a high school after school civics program. It's not a post-secondary education in government. It starts in kindergarten when we're having conversations about what was our country actually like, right? What was the truth that happened? Why are we not talking about the fact that the folks who founded this country literally committed genocide against the entire Native American people? Why are we not having a clearer conversation about the fact that our founding fathers literally owned slaves and other people? Why are we not having clear conversations about the historic trauma and the trumped up charges that caused the misunderstanding of how Black and brown people interact with our criminal justice system? And if we don't spend time in that, then we're only perpetuating those systems of inequity that fuel the school to prison pipeline and put us into these social systems of unrest that we witnessed over this summer. And I want to be clear, this is not new. For African Americans, for Black people in this country, this has been the really, quite frankly, American dream deferred for as long as we have been a part of this country, from when we first arrived here against our will. And the fact that that's not being taught in a way that really gives a holistic view of the atrocities of this country is precisely the reason that we have conversations like defund the police. It's precisely the reason we have conversations around how do we here in Seattle make our system more equitable for Black boys specifically and other students furthest from educational justice? Because it is not until we continue to have those conversations that we will actually be able to accept our history for what it is. Because until we do that, we will not realize the future that we claim to want for our children.
Ed, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Well, let me add something, because I saw something pop up in the chat, and what I don't know who sent it, but it said, "And arts are expendable." Let me come back to the original question of democracy and education. Brandon, you've probably had this experience also, but I've sat in communities in Southeast Seattle and talked to people about kind of what repair in communities and what does a healthy community look like. And that's a conversation that I think we're poised to have all over the city and all over the state post-pandemic. What does a healthy, renewed community look like? Well, people will say, we need to be healthy again, public health. We need environmental safety. We need infrastructure and economic infrastructure that's reasonably healthy. And people right there will discuss the beauty of a community, the importance of the arts, how arts are a transition of culture, how they represent health, and they're sort of all one and the same. So, and I don't know if I can say that's not being taught, but in terms of competency of a community and what a healthy community looks like, the role of the arts and actually understanding the arts, seeing the dimensions of the ways in which art has played a role in the Renaissance and in justice and in our understanding of beauty and just our understanding of what it means to be whole and healthy, the ability to sit and appreciate John Coltrane. And what a beautiful thing that is. And for us to start to imagine the kind of communities that we want, and even imagine schools that are healthy communities, we want arts to play a role in this as well. Schools can't do everything, mind you. And that's why I'm appreciating in part what I'm hearing Brandon say, which is you're operating at not only within the school, but in spaces around the school to bring community together.
Right. Yeah. It is amazing how both of you have talked about the why and about the Scouts and how there is a holistic community that has to support young people. If people look in the chat, they'll see some comments from a good friend of MOHAI's and one of our trustees, Al Young, who was a longtime educator in the Seattle Public School District. And I want to draw attention to the fact that he mentioned what happened to civics in particular, and it looks like it got shifted around a few years ago and maybe got shifted out to some extent. But Al had another question they wanted to get to, and that was that in the 1970s, the Seattle School District in particular made some real forward advances in recruiting teachers of color and administrators of color and school officials of color. Some of them were recruited from the South, from outside the area, others not. And it made a huge impact. Al himself is an Asian American educator, and he notes that in his chat. We tried it again, but with less success or follow through, perhaps in the 1990s. And we know that's an issue today as well, all these decades later. What are we doing or not doing to attract teachers of color to our school systems?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we're not doing. I think that what we have to think about, and you laid it out quite well. And I think that where we really need to begin is, what does it take to even live in a place like Seattle? In the 70s, probably not as much as it does right now. In the 90s, probably a little more than the 70s, but still not as much as it does right now. So as you think about what are all of the indirect things that are necessary for an educator to be able to live in the community where they teach, right? A salary that can keep up with the median here in Seattle, an opportunity to buy a home so that you're not locked into paying an exorbitant amount of rent. And what I really want to say is, as a policymaker, even though we have programs that we are working feverishly to not only grow our own educators in terms of recruiting folks of color to teach in our system, but what are we doing to support them outside of the classroom as a community? But then what are we also doing to support them and retain them within the system, right? Because as we all know, for teachers of color, not only are only 2% of teachers nationwide Black males, but also teachers of color burn out in 3 to 5 years as opposed to 5 to 10 years for their white counterparts. So there's something very clear that is different in terms of the experience for teachers of color, and I know what it is. For me, it's not only that I'm fighting the racism that exists within our system for our students, I'm also fighting the racism that exists in our system for myself. And I've got a small story that highlights that, right? Well, really, I've actually got two, so please humor me. The first one is that I like to wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on Fridays to my classroom. And then the person right across from me likes to wear a Blue Lives Matter t-shirt on the exact same day. I feel like she keeps it in her closet just when I get ready to wear my shirt. And so the complexity there is that while we are both protected under our union statute to wear whatever we want, there is a clear withdrawal and a clear triggering of trauma that and being exposed to a shirt like that has for me, that is just not true for the opposite, right? And then in response to me, I also have to think about, what does that mean for my second graders? I remember one instance walking in the hallway. I had a student my first year who was a little Black boy. We had a great relationship, and a cartoon that we used to watch called Dragon Ball Z came back, and it's seeing a little bit of a resurgence. And so we have a handshake that is based off of this cartoon. And like in this show, the folks charge up and they scream and they it's a really fun time. And so what we do is when we see each other in the hallway, we go, right? And we charge up or whatever. I remember my first year teaching, I was in the hallway walking in front of the gymnasium, and me and my student were doing our handshake, charging up. And one of the teachers walks out and says, "Why are you doing that? You look so aggressive. Do you want people to think that you're angry?" And then he never did that handshake with me again. And here was a white teacher who took a withdrawal from a relationship that I was building with a Black student. Now, remember, I'm the only Black teacher in the building, right? Serving 540 Black and brown students. And the one mirror that child had, the one person that looks like him in a teaching position, his relationship is now forever altered because of a snap judgment of a person that didn't have the cultural competency necessary to evaluate the situation. And so when we return back to your point, what do we need to do and what's different about, bringing educators of color into our system in the past and bringing educators of color into our system now? It's now that we're finally addressing all of those social inequities that have been present forever, but now are finally a part of the national conversation. And I think that we're not going to get to a place to where we're fully supporting teachers of color until we also make it affordable to live in a place like Seattle.
Brenda, you hit on a couple of things, and two things I take from what you said. One, from just in the conversation with you, not that you have to carry the single narrative of what it means to be an educator and to live the life and a committed life to the work of education. But you created a narrative for me that just sort of re-inspires me about, and if I were 17 or 16 years old and I was looking at you and listening to you, I think there's so much hope and possibility. I'm not sure that we carry that narrative in a way that is supportive enough of the work of teaching. And in fact, I think what we end up doing, and on my end of the spectrum, when college students are coming to a university and they have, and talented kids of color, and they have options, we've been beating the STEM drum for more than 20 years. And we've created a narrative. And it's both a narrative, but it's anchored in a certain reality. And that reality is a fiscal reality that students know other students that have graduated, have gone to work for Amazon, for Microsoft, and can live in the city of Seattle, and can maybe even live downtown, and they can vision a life for themselves. If I said you should become a 5th grade teacher at GATSERT, have we created a narrative that allows them, and the reality that allows them to be able to say, I can live in what used to be the Central District of Seattle. I can see myself there. I can see myself doing the work, and I can see myself sustained in that work. We have to create systems whereby people can actually, where we both value the work and where there's actually livable wages so that people can actually do the work. The story that I told you of Miss Jackson, who was an educator who dropped by my house, that was in a community of 12,000 people. And she lived in the neighborhood, in the community, lived up the block. And Seattle ain't that anymore. And so I don't know how we change that, but I think that's going to be some coalition building between schools, between city council, between state government. But I think we have to change the economic model now so that actually people can, in reality, and this is also from parents. These are parents who are saying, you know, son, daughter, you're really good at science, and I know you want to be a teacher, but we ain't wealthy, and I need you to do something that actually is going to. And so there ain't a whole lot of support for young people to say that this is the profession I want to engage in. So our most capable people have choices, rightly so, but we've got to do more to actually recruit and retain them in teaching. And we've got to have apprenticeship models where we can actually sustain, because you're right, Brandon, there just isn't enough to move the people through that first, second, third year of teaching. And that kind of public critique we have of education, I don't know that is helping very much. I think we need to find a way to support teachers and educators and leaders in the system. Yes, be critical, but we've got to find a way to build coalitions that actually support the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Ed. Ed, you are in the School of Education as well as being the provost at the university. And tell me how
different
was that?
Our provost would be surprised if you heard I was a provost.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a vice.
You are the vice pro. Listen, to me, you're the provost. Okay, no, you're the vice provost. But you get to see sort of the education on that university level of training educators. What's the pipeline like? Is it are students, coming to the University of Washington to become educators? Is it what's the student body look like? And
some are there. We're seeing a growth in the number of students that are interested in being educators. But again, here's an unintended consequence that Brandon and I were talking about earlier. We've been beating the STEM drum, and students have been marching to that drum. And so about 3/4 of our students, somewhere in that ballpark, are looking at things like computer science. They're looking at engineering. They're looking at school of business. And they haven't really created a narrative that says, I want to be a public school teacher. That we haven't really supported that kind of energy yet for our most talented young people, and we haven't really created systems. So yes, one of the things that I'm just so very proud of, and I think some of that is happening in Seattle public schools, a lot of it is happening in Seattle public schools. We have so many kids that are moving up through the system that are making their way through secondary schools here, and are some of our most talented students at the University of Washington. And they are kids that have learned to be in diverse environments. They have developed their skills. They are passionate. They want to stay in the state. They want to stay in the city. And we've seen some really, really talented students. And yet, we have this tension of a history that has traditionally been, for many universities around the country, have sort of narrowed the entryways so that, this narrative of you have to be a 3.9 student, which isn't really true. We have something called holistic admissions. So students really need to see this as a place where we want students with a wide breadth of talent. And in fact, something I was talking to Brandon about was we have developed a former admissions director, Phil Ballinger, something called the Presidential Scholarship. And we're actually going to give a scholarship to students, not based on grade point average, not based on test score, but based on character and leadership, intangible kinds of qualities. To go back to this question of the kind of citizens we want in the democracy, they may not be on that single metric of having done school well. But Brandon, you'll know these kids when you see them. If we talk to communities, if we go to barbershops, if we go to YMCAs, if we go to scouts and say, who are those kids in your community that really should be future educators, that should get access to college? They may not have the best grade point average, but that kind of kid that everybody wants to follow. We're actually trying to change admissions so that we start to cultivate a narrative around college admission where kids are not piling on, trying to get the best grade point, trying to be perfect, trying to do volunteer service for the sake of volunteer service, but they're actually thinking about community good. What does it mean to be a good citizen? How do I take care of my grandma and do well in school and challenge myself? And we're encouraging those kinds of young people to actually now make their way into post-secondary and to make their way in teaching and to see that as a public good as well, changing the narrative a little bit. But we've got really, really talented kids coming to the university and to post-secondary education across the state. That's one of the places where I think we're having some success. We have a long way to go. With respect to teaching, I think we have a really long way to go to have more teachers in our public schools like Brandon.
We have some really good questions in chat, and I know we're going a little bit long. Are you guys able to stay with us for a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
You might have a life outside of here, Brandon, but I'm.
I've got one. Just this is a whole nother topic for another day because I want to get to the other questions. But we have a new administration coming in. Of course, education is famously decentralized. It's all rooted in the local community, which is both its curse in terms of many, many things. Maybe it's also its blessing. But as we think about the federal government, which has been very late to education, I think we haven't had a Department of Education for more than, maybe 30 years, 40 years? Not even that long. What is the role of the federal government and what might the federal government do in a new administration? It would give some support and encouragement and move things in the direction that you guys are talking about.
Yeah, adopt Seattle Public Schools strategic plan. I think that we have probably one of the most bold and very clear strategic plans in terms of making our system safer for students of color and more representative of their real needs as compared to some other places in our country. But what I think is that we need to double down on what does it mean to be not only an educator in the system, but what does it also mean to be educated, right? So we have in this country, I really think one of the greatest divides is the folks who feel like they were back of the class kids versus folks who felt like they were front of the class kids. And really where we need to start having a conversation is how can we make a common narrative that it's not being educated that we're shooting for, we're being informed. We have a thirst for knowledge. We have a natural curiosity and an acceptance of truth and fact that transcends, our social class, whether it be race, creed, this, that, or the other. I think what I really hope to see in our next administration is the resources necessary for teachers to do our job adequately and not burn out at the same time. So that means all of those supports that we talked about before, but additionally, we need a schedule that makes sense for educators. We teach 6.5 hours a day with 45 minutes of break. We are in environments to where we have to make do based on what is available to us, and what's not available to us, I supplement, often going down into my credit card to buy various goods and supplies for my students. So if we're really going to be serious about repairing our educational system, it's got to start with taking care of the people who are delivering it and holding the profession of being an educator with the revere necessary to elevate its importance to match what we know to be true, is that the folks who are in our classrooms right now are effectively determining what the rest of our country's longevity in terms of policy and where we arrive politically looks like, because we are frankly building the electorate in each and every one of our classrooms. And we only get better as a society when we have people who understand more about how our society works and how it works effectively. And if we're not prepared to take care of the people who are doing that, and offering pay to bring those talented people, like Ed was talking about, into this profession, then we are going to continue to see the negative outcomes that we have been, because we are only talking about education in a bare minimum deficit mindset. What's not working? What's not happening? But rather, instead, we need to be having the conversation about what do we actually need to do to make it a profession that is desirable and that is sustainable more so than anything. And really quickly on that point, even going back to this idea that only or not this idea, but rather this fact that only 2% of Black men are educators in our classroom nationally, or excuse me, only 2% of teachers are Black men. Even in my role now, I am constantly being tapped to go into administration. And there's no real support for me to just become a really, really good teacher, because it is this already existing pathway that if you are a Black man in education, you're on track to be a principal, you're on track to be a superintendent. When I would much rather, just stay in my classroom and be an excellent teacher, but that's not financially possible. So we really need to think about what messages are we sending to our educators, to our communities, around what are our values in terms of our school system, and what are we prepared to change, whether it be our allocation to military funding or the amount of taxes that we pay, to make sure that our educators are taken care of.
And I'll add one thing, because your question is about the federal government also. And part of me just wants to say, I think the simple answer from my take is stay in your lane. And part of what I mean is, it's okay for the federal government to say education matters. It's okay to say education equity matters. It's fine to say education access matters and we need to push resources. But when we get down to the level of saying, okay, we're going to mandate certain kinds of tests and we're going to browbeat teachers for not meeting, you're out of your lane right now. Or for saying, okay, we're going to push vouchers or push charter school, just stay in your lane, because a colleague of mine, Ken Saratney, used to say that the school is a unit of change. And in essence, he was saying that states, that local communities are the unit of change, put more power in the hands of states and communities and schools. But the federal government should not be playing at the level of deciding what test and who. And stay in your lane and advocate for the common good, but don't get down to the level of weaponizing tests to punish teachers, to punish kids, to create incentives. That you're out of your lane. So just stay in your lane is what I would say in the end.
Yeah, I totally agree.
That's interesting. I mean, I was thinking, the federal system is so interesting because it gives so much power to our states and in education to our communities. And Brandon was making the point that maybe the history that's taught in one place is completely different than the history in another. And as I think of our fraying civic fabric nationally, I wonder if part of it's rooted in the fact that we've learned history and science and maybe some other things differently because we've come from such vastly different educational frameworks. So, but I hear your point, Ed. I'm going to end with one question, but I just want to thank Sharon and Dennis and Pepe and Alan, everybody who's been putting questions and also information into the chat. I'm learning a lot just reading the chat things. And one thing that Sharon said that I thought was interesting, she also had it framed as a question earlier and we didn't have time to get to it, is that we also, in addition to all the kind of topical subject areas, we need to also teach ethics, empathy, and what it means to be a citizen. And I think in one other comment, she said also communication. And I remember when California, maybe many decades ago now, talked about emotional intelligence and how it's so important for kids to learn that. And it was just, it became a laughing stock nationally. And I think maybe we've come to the point where we recognize that empathy is core to a functioning democracy. And so maybe teaching that early does make sense. But I think that the question I'd like to end with, if we have just a few minutes, is I know that I worry about the young people in my neighborhood that I see a lot more than I used to see. And I know that my friends with young kids in school are under great stress. And I know the teachers are under enormous stress, as are obviously the administrators and everybody involved with public education. I'm reading a lot of articles that I don't know if we're losing a generation, or maybe a generation will discover incredible talents through this period of stress that will make them stronger in some ways. But what do both of you feel about how are we going to address the stress at so many different levels, whether it's educational, emotional, in whatever way that will be the result of this pandemic, when essentially a year of traditional education will have been removed. And so many of our young people are on the wrong side of the equity equation in terms of having the resources to, to perform successfully in remote learning situations. How are we going to heal this? That's a very big question. You can answer it in any way you wish. Ed, should we start with you and we'll end with Brandon?
Oh, it's a question that I don't know has a simple answer, but I think it's a question that our community is going to have to come together on. And I think compassion has to be at the center of the answer in all aspects of this. So I think we're going to have to actually talk about what do compassionate schools look like now. There are gaps. Those gaps have existed. They've been exposed. So we need to think about what compassionate schooling looks like. We need to think about what compassionate economies look like now. What does a compassionate city look like now? We need schools to now partner with philanthropy. We need philanthropists to weigh in on this. We need the public university to weigh in on this now. When it comes to the pandemic, who gets vaccines? How do we engage in recovery? How do we make sure disproportionality in health? We know that educators aren't going to be able to close this gap now. If we don't have, and especially in the community that you're in, Brandon, if we don't have people believing that a vaccine matters and that they should get vaccinated, and that if we don't start thinking about the health of our community, if communities don't have access to the very things that everyone knows, that middle class communities know, their kids need to eat well, they need warm and compassionate places to live, they need safe communities to operate in. We need to have a renaissance of what it means to be a compassionate and safe and decent and empathic community. And that's going to take all systems working together. We can't put the weight on schools to do this. We've got to have a community come together. And there's no better time than now. I think there's a call to consciousness right now that we need to come together around.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it any better than Ed just put it. And I would just, highlight this and thinking about as we have been living through this hell that has been, especially the last year, but frankly, for a lot of us, the last 4. What I would say is, in this moment, folks talk often about these dual pandemics that we're facing, one being coronavirus and the other being racism. I would say that we're really sitting at the intersection, looking out on the horizon of a third pandemic of being mental health. I would think that, as we live in a society now that is more connected than ever before, our children are experiencing loneliness at higher rates than ever before in the history of our species, right? And so what we need to be prepared to do as a system is to educate, again, on things like empathy, socio-emotional well-being, awareness in how we as individuals feel and show up to social settings. I think that where we lose a lot of that is as our education system has changed so dramatically to try to keep up with our changing job market just simply over the last decade, that we've begun setting all of these arbitrary timetables for how many hours a student needs to spend in school. How many of those hours do they need to spend learning math? How many of those hours do they need to spend learning reading? And yet we only allot 10 minutes, if you're lucky, for socio-emotional learning and developing an understanding of self. And so until we are prepared to give that section of what it means to be a human being, quite frankly, where we used to get that from our interpersonal relationships with our teachers and with our educators and with our community, and as we move away from the traditional model of living in one community for the rest of our lives, now to in a place to where you can move across the country in a heartbeat, uproot everything that you're used to. kids today do not have those same tribal communities where that type of socio-emotional education was happening on a frequent basis. You know, the way that kids play together nowadays is very different. What kids consider to be fun and imaginative nowadays is very different. And so until we are ready to accept that fact, and we are ready to incorporate, you know, socio-emotional learning as a core competency in terms of our curriculum, then we're not going to reach those outcomes. It's just simply not possible, because you have to be able to teach it. And if we do not know how to teach it, and if we are not presenting it in a way that can be digestible and understood at every level, starting from kindergarten, going all the way through whatever that person's educational pathway might be, then we also need to be prepared to see more of the same. Quite frankly, more of the same is not going to work for me and Ed's community. More of the same is not going to work for our community nationally. And I refuse to be a part of an educational system that is complacent with mediocrity. We have to all do our part to innovate, right? Because what really drives it home for me is that when we talk about educational innovation, folks try to think of it as, you know, this big, epiphany or revelation, when really innovation just means connecting two things that were previously disconnected. So if we can figure out ways to truly innovate in its most simple form, connecting kids with the learning necessary to be functional, thoughtful, empathetic human beings, then I think that we're going to see the outcomes that our children deserve, not only locally, but nationally as well.
Wonderful.
Brandon, I think on that note, that is a wonderful way to conclude our program this evening. Ed Taylor, Provost and Vice Provost, and Dean of Undergraduate Academic Affairs at the UW, and School Board Director Brandon Hersey, who also is a public school teacher in Federal Way. I just want to thank both of you, not only for your time tonight, but for your amazing service to our community and to our kids. And I know that when you're speaking, you're really also asking each of us to stay engaged, to stay informed, and to stay supportive, because our kids really are our future, and you guys are right there in the front line. So thank you for that. And thank all of you for joining us this evening for our Democracy Dialogue. The series, we're going to take a little break for the holidays, but the series continues early next year and goes all the way to March. We've got great support in bringing these programs to you, both from For Culture and from Amazon and from so many of our MOHAI supporters. And our next program is on January 9th, and it's called Understanding the Election. And if you have any questions left about this election on January 9th, we're going to tie them all up. So you got to make it for that. If you've learned something new or enjoyed it, please join us at MOHAI. Feel free to become a member or make a gift. There's information on how to do that when we leave you this evening. And again, thank you so much for joining us for our Democracy Dialogues. Hope you have a great evening. Please stay safe and healthy. And thank you again. Good night.
Take care.
Take care.